BioCentury This Week is brought to you by RemeGen Co. RemeGen is a leading biopharmaceutical company in China committed to discovering, developing, and commercializing innovative biologic drugs to address unmet medical needs in patients with autoimmune and ophthalmic diseases and cancer. RemeGen's flagship drug, telitacicept, is a first-in-class BLyS-APRIL dual-targeting fusion protein drug that has been launched in China for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and is in late-stage development for various autoimmune diseases, such as myasthenia gravis, IgA nephropathy, and primary Sjogren's syndrome. RemeGen has research labs and offices across China and the United States.
The bear market is back with a vengeance after Trump's tariffs shock global markets and spark fears of a recession. Plus, a proposed reorganization at FDA and the continued impact of staffing cuts and political interference at the agency and NIH, and the growth of VEGF bispecifics at AACR. We'll discuss all of this on today's BioCentury This Week. I'm Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence here at BioCentury, and joining me are my colleagues
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
So I guess there's really only kind of one place for us to start, right? I mean, I think, we're recording this on the Monday. The markets, seem to be reeling for their third straight session, following the Trump administration's unveiling of these worldwide tariff regime that seems to have caught quite a few people off guard on the street. I think in terms of the size and breadth of the tariffs. If you recall our 2025 market preview that we published in January, there we kind of discussed what the bull and bear scenarios for biotech might be this year. And, unfortunately, it really kind of seems like the bear scenario is very much the one that's playing out, through the first quarter of the year.
Wouldn't you say this is even more bear than the bear that people predicted?
It's
Stephen?
pretty bear. Yeah, it's. I mean, there were some various branches of a bad market that we explored, and we're going down some of the worst paths. That's for sure. Yeah, I mean, so we just ran last week our 2Q25 preview, and those conversations were the sentiment is bad. There's no other way. There's no way to sugarcoat this. I know, biotech investors love to say that they're eternally optimists because they have to be, given how hard the markets can be for biotech. I think this is a time where that sort of never-ending optimism has to kind of shine through.
Yeah, but Stephen, let's be honest. In previous crashes or whatever, the fundamentals of how the market operates were pretty well understood. And so you didn't have this same uncertainty. And so people just don't know whether, this is inside and outside of biotech, of course. They don't know how long the tariffs are going to be there for and if they're going to get worse and if he really means it and yada, yada. And then in our sector, obviously, we have this extra level of uncertainty that I know that Steve Usden is going to expand on related to regulatory uncertainty. And as I wrote on my piece on Friday, I think it's 2 decades since we've had this level of regulatory uncertainty. You got 4 ex-commissioners calling it out. And what that means is that you've got a whole crop of CEOs who've never lived in that kind of environment. They might have seen financial downturns, but they haven't seen this kind of thing at FDA. Steve, it's you start weighing in here now.
No, actually, I think that this is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this before. I was looking back at the headlines of the stories, some of the stories I wrote over the last week. Pandemonium at FDA. Peter Stein pushed out as head of OND, thousands of layoffs. FDA layoffs could cripple agency, former FDA commissioners say. Reviews of novel drugs could be disrupted. Long-term plans for FDA unclear. FDA cuts put orphan, novel, and repurposed approvals at risk. Pushing out scientific leadership and policy staff narrows approval aperture. McCary facing key test. FDA commissioner must swiftly reverse decision to conduct a political review of a COVID vaccine or risk irreparable damage to FDA's credibility. And then this morning, former FDA officials call HHS plan for agency nonsensical and unworkable. We've never seen anything like this before. If the cuts that were announced last week, if a lot of them aren't rescinded, it really is difficult to imagine how FDA is going to function going forward. It's completely unpredictable. The political uncertainty now that has been introduced by having a political appointee review the Novavax COVID-19 vaccine is also unprecedented. And it's not just about vaccines. As I wrote last week, first, it's about any therapeutic areas that have caught the attention of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Make America Healthy Again crowd. But it's also potentially about medical products where people who are influential in the Trump administration have a financial or personal interest. So it really opens up an enormous set of concerns. I still think that McCary has a narrow window now to kind of slam shut some of these issues. So far, there's no evidence that he either wants to or can do it. But
tell us what that would look like, Steve.
Well, it would look like two things. One, it would look like, as I said, rescinding some of the cuts so that people who are really essential to making FDA function are there and able to do their jobs. And the other would be making it clear that FDA isn't going to apply political tests to drug approvals.
Yeah, I mean, so in all my conversations, someone already mentioned companies have already the major uncertainty of the macroeconomic risk, and then you layer on top of that the regulatory uncertainty. Every investor I spoke to, their biggest fear was FDA getting the head cut off and then getting the staff reduced down to the fact to where it's just a disaster for the agency. And it sounds like, is that a fair? Are those fears, well warranted?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're not unreasonable fears, and there are other levels of fear that you can layer on top of that, or layers of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen with reauthorization of user fees. It's possible that FDA will that they'll stumble into a situation where they won't be able to collect user fees going forward. There's so-called triggers in the law that if FDA fires too many people, then it may be that they hit one of those triggers and they're either unable to collect additional user fees, or the amount of user fees that they can collect are reduced. And then going forward, there's a concern that RFK, McCary, other people in the administration who are opposed or have said that they're opposed to user fees actually mean it. If that were to happen and we were to not see a reauthorization of user fees, it would be another layer of uncertainty and potential disaster for the review of medical products in the United States.
So, Steve, it's pretty clear that people in the industry and lobbyists are not happy about the way things are going for biopharma. What do you think is going on behind the scenes?
I think that there are competing factions who have different ideas about what should be done and how it should be done. There's a faction in the administration, headlined by Elon Musk and the Doge, who really want to eviscerate government and transfer as much power and authority as possible to the private sector. And it may be that in some areas of the economy, that's something that business interests would be applauding, but it's certainly not the case for the biopharmaceutical industry, which really depends on a strong, competent regulatory agency.
Well, okay, let me just stop you just there, okay, and because I want to hear the rest of it. But we do know that even inside our industry, there are people who call for a sort of, what should we call it, a libertarian approach, where only, drugs only should be shown to be safe and let the market decide if it's efficacious, which is a tremendously different standard, and even, I think, against what Congress has enacted. So there are those calls as well. I don't know how loud they are.
I don't think that they're very loud. I don't think that they're very common. And as you note, they're also not legal. There are legal standards for demonstrating safety and efficacy, and the FDA doesn't have the discretion to throw them out the window and say that they're not going to enforce them anymore. So yes, what's behind it. I think that there's a certain level of pleasure with the kind of chaos that's been created by factions that do want to see any competency and any capacity in government eviscerated. There are political agendas around vaccines, and generally, I think the Make America Healthy Again movement opposes modern medicine. It opposes science-based regulation of medicine, and opposes broadly speaking, the development of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. So I think that's playing into this also.
So Steve, just to take sort of my earlier question about, from the investor perspective, maybe a layer deeper. So one of the things that I had several of them sort of expressed was this concern that since you've had so much of the FDA leadership leave, I guess expectation is that you're then largely going to replace them from the internal ranks. You're going to have people sort of stepping up that had been below. And the worry was that if you're taking from the ranks of the reviewers, are those almost inherently going to be more conservative people that have more conservative views about data and, efficacy and safety? And if you kind of couple that with maybe this perception, at least, of pressure from top down, that there could be an increased focus on safety, does the combination of that bring about a situation where the bar is actually higher for drugs? And I guess obviously particular vaccines, but is there some, sense to that thesis that you could actually see the bar for getting a drug approved increase because of this?
It's a reasonable narrative. We don't know whether it's true or not. We don't know what's going to happen. The cuts have been so deep that there are functions that FDA performs that aren't going to be possible or certainly aren't going to be easy to do. For example, accelerated approval outside of the context of cancer drugs was heavily dependent on an office that was part of the Office of New Drugs, the Office of Policy. That was eliminated, basically. I've heard people inside FDA and outside of FDA express the concern that it will be really difficult to get accelerated approval for anything outside of cancer now, unless some of that expertise is brought back into the agency. There are other kind of concerns around the 505(b)(2) pathway, which is used often for getting new formulations, new dosages, repurposing drugs. Again, the expertise that's needed to make that pathway function has walked out the door or has been kicked out the door. And so there's a concern about whether it will be possible to use that pathway, how viable it will be. On the other hand, there are some countervailing forces. There's a sense that Marty Makary wants to make it easier to do first in human studies, for example, some things like that. But it's not clear at all that he has the staff in place who could turn any of those ideas into reality. So in general, I think if you look at it and you say it's going to be more difficult to get anything approved. The other thing is that there's a much greater level of uncertainty now because it's not going to be easy, and in many cases, it's likely to be impossible for companies to have the kinds of interactions with FDA reviewers that they've been having for the last decade. So for the last decade, there's been a tendency to have increased interactions between sponsors and FDA reviewers. So sponsors have a better sense of what FDA is going to require, and FDA has a better sense of what companies are going to deliver. And there's a kind of interaction between the two that leads to more confidence that companies are on track to be able to meet FDA's requirements for approval. If you pull the plug on that communication, which is really what's been done, and you, by the way, make it virtually impossible for FDA to write or issue new guidance documents, companies are going to be flying in the dark. They're not going to know as well whether what they're doing at the end of the day is going to satisfy FDA's demands. That means we're likely to see more unexpected regulatory decisions, many of them on the downside in late stages, than we would have if the kind of interaction that has been occurring over the last few years were continued.
Steve, to what degree do you think Congress is going to hold FDA and HHS RFK Jr. accountable for these things?
It's really unclear. When Senator Cassidy voted for RFK Jr. as HHS secretary, he extracted a number of commitments from him. Among them was a commitment to keep Cassidy and the Senate Health Committee well informed of his plans, and a commitment to come in and talk to them when Cassidy wanted to talk to him. So Cassidy sent RFK Jr. a letter last week demanding that he come in on April the 10th to testify at a hearing about the HHS reorganization and about all the cuts. It remains to be seen whether Kennedy's actually going to appear for that hearing. As of this morning, there was no indication that he intended to do it. I certainly wouldn't put any money on him doing it. And by the way, the other thing that we haven't mentioned that I think bears mentioning is that the same kind of concerns and dysfunction that's happening at FDA is also happening at NIH. There have been massive layoffs there, contracts have been canceled, and NIH's ability to give grants, to conduct research, to do oversight, all of those things are being put in question. Alarms are ringing all over the life sciences community. At some point, you would expect that Congress would step up and ask what's happening and try to figure out a path back to something that's more sustainable. But so far, there's no evidence that Republicans in either House of Congress are willing to go there yet.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Really, really insightful and obviously of massive importance for our sector here. So I'm sure we'll be keeping close tabs on this going forward. We'll take a quick break and we will be right back.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago this June after ASCO for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
All right, welcome back. Now I'm going to turn to Lauren for what I hope will be some respite from the doom and gloom that otherwise seems to infiltrate every minute of our days over the past weeks. Lauren, so AACR is coming up at the end of the month, and I think you've been digging through some of the abstracts. Can you tell us kind of what jumped out to you? What are some of the important trends that you've seen?
Yeah, so we've just started to go through the abstracts, and the first story that we'll have will be likely in tomorrow's issue. But we're looking into what's happening with VEGF bispecifics. This is something that's on everyone's mind. Everyone's looking forward to the data that should come out from the Summit and Akeso program in non-small cell lung cancer in maybe a couple months. And what I found at AACR, there's plenty of Me Too activity. There are many, many companies that are doing the VEGF by PD-1 design. A lot of them are doing the Avastin as the VEGF component. That's not all that's happening. There is a lot of early stage innovation in the design of these bispecifics. So some companies that have abstracts at AACR are describing different VEGF binders, for example. And where that may benefit is, you may just better be able to target and suppress the angiogenesis that's happening in tumors. But also there's a concern that if patients have been treated with Avastin, there might be an anti-drug antibody type issue. And then beyond that, it's not just PD-1 and PD-L1 as the BioNTech program has, but some other targets that are being combined with VEGF inhibitors. We have a program that is combining a VEGF binding domain with the TGF-beta binding domain. So that's a target that's been really difficult. I don't know how that program will turn out, but maybe this is a way to find success with TGF-beta. There are other checkpoint inhibitors or checkpoint targets. There's one program that stimulates 4-1BB when VEGF is bound.
Lauren, tell us a little bit. I mean, this is obviously going beyond the T-cell engager idea that's sort of dominated by specifics in cancer, right? In this case, you, especially with VEGF and something else, you're bringing together like different biologies, right? Are there other mechanisms within these bispecifics that suggest new frontiers in the field, that people are trying different pathways?
So VEGF is just the VEGF and checkpoint inhibitor combination is just one example of this creating novel biology through a bispecific format. We've already seen success with Rybrevant that is combining the EGFR and c-Met pathways. And there the idea is that you're blocking resistance mechanisms before they happen. c-Met can be a main resistance mechanism for EGFR. We also have an abstract at AACR that combines an EGFR and c-Met inhibitor and VEGF in a tri-specific format. So that's something else that came out at the conference. We've been seeing across the bispecific space a lot, or across the multi-specific space, a lot of tri-specific design. So this is something that hasn't, had a ton of proof of concept yet. But within these VEGF bispecific antibodies or multi-specific antibodies, I mean, it's like a third of them are actually add a third targeting domain. So a lot of those are PD-1, CTLA-4, and VEGF, or combining IL-2 domain, things like that. So it'll be really interesting to see if that builds on the efficacy of just the bispecific designs, or if that's too complicated in manufacturing and getting the binding right.
Great. Well, thank you, Lauren, very much. As you already mentioned, you can find Lauren's story hopefully going to be out tomorrow. Check out the full publication there. And finally, I think we'll spend a little bit more time talking about sort of the impact that tariffs and sort of this the markets have had on companies in terms of their ability to finance and raise capital. And again, from our 2Q preview story that published last Friday, one of the things that sort of stuck out to me was just even in the first quarter, how bad things were, right? I mean, there was, if you looked at financing activity, it was back down to the same levels as we saw in the last bear market in like the second quarter of 22. So there was already not great setting for biotech. And then you layer on this sort of unexpected shock from the tariffs, and it just makes things feel like it's going from bad to worse.
So what does all this mean for companies, Stephen?
What it means is that companies are going to have to go back to these survival strategies that they became all too familiar with in the 22-23 period. So this means, that once again, cash is king. Investors, I know, were saying that they were sort of keenly assessing sort of company burn rates, kind of looking at for ways in which they can sort of pare down. So capital efficiency, sort of pipeline prioritization, these are all kind of key near-term things that companies need to be thinking about, really focusing in on your highest value asset and really trying to drive that to a near-term milestone as quickly as you can.
Stephen, just tell us the numbers. It looked from your preview that the number of or proportion of NASDAQ listed biotechs with less than a year of cash was actually down, meaning a better scenario than a few years ago. So what does it look like now, and what's gone on in the last quarter?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, that I think is maybe one of the small bright spots, right? Is that I think companies were able to, especially given the experience from 22-23, when the markets were a bit more open and companies were able to raise last year, they definitely took advantage of that. So I think there's a lot of companies that, if this is a sort of short downturn, sort of shock to the markets, I think there's a lot of companies that are pretty well positioned to be able to ride this out. But if you hadn't for some reason been able to take advantage of the markets last year and you do need to raise capital, the other sort of bright spot, I guess, is that if you've got a catalyst coming up, even what we saw, during the worst times of the first quarter, you can still raise money on the back of a catalyst. Investors are still willing to put money into something that they think is materially de-risked. The issue comes if you don't have a catalyst and you're still short on cash, which is it's a bad spot to be in a market like this. That's when you really need to start thinking about alternative options. So that's, ATMs, pipes, registered directs, royalty-based financings. I mean, I think at that point, as one banker told me, pretty much everything and anything has to be on the table, because this was another sort of idiom that was, repeated several times during these conversations, was that, dilution is always better than running out of money. So I think boards need to really take that to heart, in a time like this, if they're in a pretty bad situation.
So, Stephen, you had, 35 companies listed in the IPO queue, something like that?
Something like that, yep. And I imagine that list is only going to, it's probably going to stay about the same for a little while, I think. I don't think we're going to see many companies get out. I think the only way to even contemplate it, at a time like this would be if you were, for some reason, had no inside support whatsoever, which already would be a bad starting place for IPOs. But then I had a few people talk about, the options of doing really aggressive financing, like literally like taking a down round in an IPO. But yeah, I think even if that were going to happen, I think you'd probably have to wait a while until after kind of the shock effects of these post-Liberation Day market turmoil kind of subsides, because I don't think anyone's going to try anytime soon where they sit. But this is the thing. I had people that, again, as I said, investors being eternally optimist. A couple of them, made mention of the fact that despite all the uncertainty that we have, there is still the potential that if for whatever reason the administration decides that, hey, these tariffs are actually pretty bad for markets, maybe we should step back from this and pull back on them, this could reverse fairly quickly as well if those policies, were rescinded essentially. So that's the problem, I guess, that you mentioned even right off the top. That's the challenge that companies and investors face in this market is you can't really predict. At least in 22 and 23, we knew what was driving the markets down and we knew what needed to happen to bring them back up. I don't think we have either of those things at this point. And so that's the hard part.
Well, next week we'll have a whole much happier conversation, perhaps. Who knows?
One can only hope. One can only hope, Simone. Right. And speaking of conversations, you can tune into our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show, that was out last week and featured Simone in conversation with Immunocore's CEO, Bahija Jalal, discussing how the now commercial stage biotech is expanding its platform into new settings. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment or review. You can find all of these stories at biocenturypodcast.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next week. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.
BioCentury would like to thank RemeGen for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about RemeGen's products and pipelines, you can go to www.remegen.com.